Thank you all for being here today. Thanks to the panelists for joining us. And can we give a warm round of applause to Global Ties for putting this together today? So I represent the Alliance for International Exchange. We are an association of 90 organizations, and we represent the collective exchange community in the United States. And through our exchange partners, their employees, participants, we have hundreds of thousands of people throughout the United States. And I'm proud of the work that they do. We're also proud to be co-sponsors of this event today. We've heard a lot about the power of exchanges today, and I can speak from a personal perspective, having participated in an exchange program right after law school in Albania after the fall of communism there. And then a few years later, as a professional, helping to set up an exchange program, helping Kosovo women leaders develop their leadership skills. And of course, as a naturalized citizen, I think that's the ultimate exchange program. So I'm happy to be here with all of you. So before we get into a conversation about how we harness the universe of non-governmental exchange programs, I'm hoping our panelists can help set the table so that we understand what we're talking about. And let me start with Marlene. What do we mean by non-governmental exchange programs? How are they similar? How are they different?
Well, I think maybe I'll start with just a brief description of NAFSA. Most of you perhaps know, but I know the governor doesn't know about NAFSA until today. So for her, I'll say that we are the organization that reflects most of what's going on in higher education as it relates to student mobility, and increasingly we're also focused on issues of global learning at the curriculum level. So it is really a focus on how it is we help our students become more engaged in the world, how we more of a deep learning about the world and their understanding of how they fit in the world and the relationships between themselves and others different from them, the relationships between the US and other countries in the world. And historically, NAFSA was created out of a public policy. After World War II, the State Department established the programs, the Marshall Plan. A big part of the Marshall Plan was higher education mobility of European students coming to this country, the Fulbright program. And increasingly, the State Department recognized that the universities needed to be very intentional about how they welcome those international students to their campus. So a field service was created, providing training programs around the country, and many of the individuals who participated in developing those programs got together and said, whoa, we need an organization. We need to be even more intentional. We need an association where we professionalize our work. And so out of that came the National Association of Foreign Student Affairs. Now we just use NAFSA with Association of International Educators, because today we are those who work with international students on our campuses, those who work to send US students abroad, and those faculty who are engaged in internationalizing curriculum. To the specific question of public sector scholarships or programs versus private sector, I think at the beginning, it was largely a public sector, a public policy driven and a publicly funded initiative, Fulbright being an example. Today, the majority of mobility is privately funded. It might be family funded. It might be programs such as 100,000 Strong in Latin America, a program of the Obama administration that was mentioned earlier today, I think, on a panel. Those programs are definitely directed by public policy, the president's initiative and a public statement about why these programs are so important, but the funding is coming from governments, other governments than the US, as well as considerable support from corporations. And in the case of international students coming to this country, the ones the governor was mentioning that provide such an economic support for the state of Ohio and many other states, that information is provided on NAFSA's website, so you can actually look at it by congressional district. Many of those students are coming as private paying students, the undergraduates. The graduate students come in a variety of ways. Sponsored programs might be administered by IIE, and Allan will talk more about that. But there's an increasing number of students, undergraduate students particularly, coming as private pay or sponsored by their family corporations, family foundations, those kinds of things, as well as public programs that are supported by our Department of State, sometimes the National Science Foundation, sometimes other governments. Brazil has been a big supporter of exchange in the last few years. China continues to be, and many other countries as well.
Thank you. Allan?
So the universe is not vast, as the title might suggest, but it is pretty big. In our latest book, where we look at exchanges and opportunities for international students to come to America, we now list over 800 of these opportunities. A decade ago, there were only about 100 programs. So the private university is growing, and along with that, universities are also creating their own foreign policies. The Ohio State University was among the first to do so, and in conjunction with the state of Ohio and the governor's office and the offices that you set up abroad in India and China. So foreign policies are as important for universities that are intentional about internationalization as they are for governments. Where the U.S. government really helps us is that most Americans study abroad for a very short period of time. U.S. government programs probably fund now 95% of the Americans that go abroad for more than a semester or for a year, and deep immersion in a culture and language study. So public policy intentionality there is really important because the Marine Corps is not an exchange program in the sense that even the general would like to see it.
Great. Christian, what do you think of when you think of non-governmental exchange programs?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Global Ties for the invite. It's a great honor to be here for the German Robert Bosch Stiftung, the Bosch Foundation. And, well, I was thinking when I was looking at the biographies of my co-panelists, what I could contribute and what the Bosch Foundation could contribute to this to this great panel here. I think maybe I can.
We know what the foundation could contribute, and we'd welcome it.
Maybe.
And it'll be announced here.
Yes. Well, maybe I say a couple of words about the foundation. You know, it's one of the largest European foundations associated with a private company, but we're not the CSR branch of the company. We're an independent organization, and it leads back to Robert Bosch's will. I mean, that can be seen in the spirit of, well, you had many of those in the US, the successful industrialists who, at the turn of the century, the 19th to the 20th, that is, felt the responsibility to give back to society. And so he made sure that 92% of the shares of the company, which are not publicly traded, went to the foundation. And so out of the dividend of these shares, we finance our projects. And just to give you a figure, because there is differences between the German foundation system and the American foundation system. When I say large European or German foundation, for American standards, it'd rather be second division, maybe, something like that. So we have an annual budget for projects of about 70 to 80 million euros. And a large portion of which, around 60%, go into international projects, because Robert Bosch wanted to, well, he gave us, his mission statement was that he wanted to foster public health, education, and international understanding. And he also added, and the like, which is wonderful. That's an opening clause. I mean, that gives us opportunities. He was a visionary, not only as an entrepreneur, but also as a founder, because he realized that 100 years ago, he could not foresee challenges that are there today. For example, he was one of, I think he had 11 brothers and sisters. Nowadays, we deal with an issue of demographic change at the Bosch Foundation. 100 years ago, Bosch would have said, what the heck is that, demographic change? I mean, people will always get children. I mean, no, they will not. In Germany, that's a big challenge, as you know, as in Europe and the whole different situation in the US. So I thought maybe I can contribute a little bit by looking at at our toolbox of exchange programs and what we do, where we think that we can make contributions. And when I looked at our overall portfolio, I thought that we could see three strategic approaches, three categories, so to speak. One is the classical or traditional bilateral exchange for relationship building. That came under some kind of scrutiny at the Bosch Foundation in Germany as well over the past couple of years when it came to German-American programs, German-French programs, because everybody said, come on, relationships are great, why do we need these exchange programs anymore? Therefore, I was very thankful for my fellow German, where is it, Dennis, the comment, who made the case, at least that's my reading of the case, that you should not take such established relationships for granted. Therefore, there is a high value, I think, for programs like that. In this context, our cornerstone, so to speak, is the Robert Bosch Foundation Fellowship Program, which is very unusual. We've been running this for 32 years now. This is usually not the case that we have such long-running programs. We have our key partner, Cultural Vistas, is also represented here. Rob is there, sitting next to an alum, Adam of the Bosch Fellowship. Great to see you. That is our most traditional, but also I'd say one of the most successful programs. Second category would be more topic-oriented, more focused program be it on a bilateral or multilateral level of where we try to bring together different, experts, multipliers, leaders from different countries who more or less face similar problems, working on those issues. There's a program we just started also with Cultural Vistas that looks at immigration and integration and the challenges we face in Germany and you face here in the US, and we look for a best practice exchange there. And the third category, I'd say, and this is becoming more and more important for us, is multilateral formats. Because and this was mentioned before, with more and more challenges becoming global in scope, problems, there are so many problems that can only be solved not on a unilateral, not on a bilateral, but on a multilateral basis. Cybersecurity, climate change, global pandemics, I could go on forever. And there, we started to create programs that include more than 2 countries. We have one program, a new one called Global Governance Futures, where we bring together young leaders, not only from the US and Germany, but also from China, India, and Japan. And with those kind of programs, totally new challenges also arise, because it's a little bit easier to bring Americans and Germans together, given that still, I'd say, we share many, many values, but it's a different ballgame when you bring in, for example, Chinese participants. But with programs like this, we try to face reality that there needs to be all international players who have a stake in a certain issue need to be around the table and need to be part of the exchange.
Yeah. So Christian, strikes me hearing you talk about your programs that we had a panel up here a little while ago talking about the importance of trying to look at a problem and then bringing people together in an exchange to solve that problem. And this is an instance where a non-governmental program is doing exactly that, right? So the idea of, let's innovate, let's do things a little differently, and what you're talking about sounds exactly like that. Mm-hmm. There was also a question at the beginning of the afternoon about the numbers, how many people come here in exchange programs, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe through funded programs, about 55,000 participants, non-funded, non-governmental funded, over 300,000. And then if you talk about international students here in the United States, we're talking about close to 1 million. So just in terms of scale, when you're thinking about governmental versus non-governmental, we have a lot more people coming to the United States on these exchange programs that are not part of a US-funded program. Isn't that right, Allan?
Well, I know some in the audience are worried about how many members of Congress have a passport. I'm worried about how few Americans actually study abroad through these exchange programs. Probably now 75% of Congress has a passport. I don't think 10% of our college students do. And we know only about 10% of Americans in any form of higher education will have an abroad experience. We hope, as the board member that Marlene and I shared, Senator Simon, that we can, within the end of this decade, at least double the number of Americans that study abroad, because it's so urgent for our people to get out in the world, whether they're from Ohio or Washington State, because they're our real cultural ambassadors. And most people in the world have never met an American. And the impact of meeting an American abroad, doing community service, in school also, is often very profound. So the number that really matters to me for our work is will we succeed, at least in doubling the number by the end of this decade.
Yeah. Can you talk just a little bit about Generation Study Abroad initiative, and then Marlene, I'll come back to you. Talk a little bit about that initiative. How large is it? What's the goal? Which organizations are part of this? And what have you seen so far? What's your experience been with the initiative so far?
We call it our moonshot. It's to try to achieve a really difficult goal, do it within the course of a decade, and go from about 220,000, 250,000 to close to 600,000 Americans studying abroad by 2019, 2020. If we did nothing, and we know that study abroad is popular these days, we all know somebody that's done it, but if we just waited for the rate of natural increase, the average rate of growth, we wouldn't get to doubling the number of Americans until 2035 or 2037. So like the original moonshot, it's something we oughtn't to postpone, and it's critical to our leadership in the world. We have now 600 partners, 13 countries. Many universities have joined us in the 600 partners, pledging to double their numbers to study abroad. Some have very high ratios, but what they're doing is focusing on the students that don't get the chance to study abroad, or the students that are physically challenged and wouldn't think of studying abroad. Or whole systems have joined us and said, we're not going to start in the flagship campus, we're going to start in the campus where few students do it, because that's the group in the population we want to reach. And we have 13 partner countries at this point, because if we're successful, all these Americans going abroad can't fit into England, where they traditionally go. So we need countries, yours included, signing up and saying, we'd welcome Americans to have this opportunity.
Marlene, you were going to say something.
Well, I think there are two thoughts I have. One, building on what Allan said in terms of doubling the numbers. From our standpoint and from the goals set out by Senator Paul Simon several years ago when the Lincoln Commission was created, and then the Simon concept of the leveraged approach to study abroad, one of the most important goals of that initiative, which is part of Generation Study Abroad for most of the schools that are participating, is to increase the diversity of who studies abroad and where they study. The demographics of study abroad must look like the demographics of our student body. And right now that doesn't. Right now the average study abroad student is still a white female humanities student. Now we have more engineers studying abroad than we did 10 years ago, so that's good. We have more of everything, but we really aren't making the kind of inroads we need to make with the diversity of our students economically and racially. And we need to make more progress on the diversity of destination. So that's why the President's initiative on 100,000 strong in China is so important. We did reach 100,000 in China, and the movement now, the next goal of that initiative is to have students studying Mandarin in every school district in America, and I think that's a very exciting, and to the point that was made by the previous panel. The other point I wanted to make in terms of how NAFSA has been looking at this broader issue is that no matter how successful we are at increasing the numbers of students who study abroad, we will not get to everybody. And that is one of the most important reasons why we need to focus some of our attention on the global learning aspects of our students' education. We need the curriculum to have a global perspective. We need faculty, engineering faculty and math faculty and public health faculty to look at what are the cross-cultural implications of the things that they're teaching. Are they using international students in their classroom as resources to help American students understand a different perspective on whatever the issue is, whether it's English literature or math or religious studies or whatever it is. And as we have established colloquia, faculty colloquia on internationalizing curricula, it's really exciting to me to see the growing interest on the part of faculty in a number of disciplines, from law and engineering to public health to the STEM disciplines and teacher education, because that is where we can not only focus on study abroad, which is very, very important, but as students, whoever they are, get a better understanding of global perspectives in a range of disciplines, they will also be more likely to want to reach out and travel someplace. So that's just another piece that as we all look at our strategies and take a look at what our schools are doing, whether they are K-12 schools or university education, the opportunity to globalize a learning approach is very important.
Christian?
Yeah, in this context, I'd like to add something. You know, again, with our limited resources, the Bosch Foundation does not give out scholarships. We don't send many students abroad. There's other German organizations that do it, like the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD. I was a recipient of a DAAD scholarship once that got me to Charm City, Baltimore, Johns Hopkins. So it was the best time of my university life. I even didn't want to go back to my home university. But they actually forced us to get the degree in Germany because they were afraid if we stayed here, we would stay here. But I mean, and their budget compared to ours is vast. So we constantly think, how can we complement programs like you just described, and where's our niche where we can provide added value? And when it comes to globalizing education, for example, we have a program that proved very effective. That's the Transatlantic Outreach Program. And that reaches out to American social studies teachers. And the idea is there that we had an interest years ago when the program started, together with the Goethe Institute, the Siemens Foundation, the German Federal Foreign Office. We wanted to get a more modern picture of Germany into American heads, speaking about public diplomacy here. And so it was a very innovative approach back then because we didn't know that before. This is always very important for us. We need American partners. We need partners on site. And in this case, it's not an American partner, but it's the Goethe Institute here. They work together with the social studies teachers, not union, but the conference. And the idea was, since there's so much flexibility in the curriculum for the teachers here, that if we provided interesting, engaging materials that had to do something with Germany, that could be implemented. And the teachers loved it. We invited them to come to Germany to get to know modern Germany and look at issues that are of interest, again, for their students here and for America in general. Again, renewable energies, migration, integration, the topics I mentioned before. And it works very well because with very limited resources, we invite those teachers. They commit to becoming trainers who train other trainers in the US. And so with our very modest contribution and the strong will of our American partners and the teachers, something is happening in there. We now go beyond social studies to STEM. And it's not at all a one-way learning experience. We in Germany learn at least as much. So just to say what we're doing and what I think is important for, at least from the European perspective, for a private foundation, we're not there. We lack the resources and we don't want to provide any kind of competition. We want to complement niches, see where we can provide something to complement the work that the greater players.
Right, in a highly focused way. I want to bring the conversation just for a moment back to diversity. So there's a lack of, well, I shouldn't say gender diversity, an imbalance. And you talked about people primarily going to Europe, and I think primarily humanities focus. But we also have a socioeconomic challenge when it comes to exchange programs. I can speak for myself. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college. When I was thinking about a program that was off campus, I thought Washington, D.C. Why? Needed to go build up my my contacts, my resume, learn something useful that might turn into a job, and I think I was successful. But I wasn't thinking about studying abroad. I mean, certainly after law school, my wife and I did that. We had an exchange experience. But how do we draw in people from that kind of background to international exchange? And is that important to do?
I think they're already there. That's what we experience in administering the State Department's Gilman program that Congressman Gilman here set up for students that were on Pell Grants. And the theory was that they had a dream too, and they would think about studying abroad as well. And if they could take their financial aid abroad and a little extra, they would do it. And the application rates are through the roof because they have the dream. Our job is to make sure the financial aid offices know that it's possible to do this, that the resources are there to help them fund travel, that the destinations are there all over the world, that students from very diverse backgrounds are welcome, and there are ambassadors abroad that helps us achieve the goal that Marlene is talking about, where Americans abroad begin to look like America, as they should.
How many people have participated in that program, Allan, would you say, and how many applications are there compared to
We get about 12,000 applications a year. There are currently 2,500 grants, and so many students find also through the process other opportunities to go. But what it tells us is they have the dream, just like the traditional study abroad student did.
Sure.
I would say that I think that every time a student applies for a grant, even when they don't receive it, to Allan's point, they start getting more clarity to their own goal and their own personal vision for wanting to study abroad. There were lots of examples of that, even with AFS and AIFS over the years. So I think that is true. So we are beginning to make some inroads. There are also, as part of the 100,000 Strong in Latin America initiative, which is the administration, it's President Obama's initiative, that's all private money and it's all leverage support. So there is no direct scholarship like the Gilman Scholarship, but the grants are to the universities, and one of their jobs is to have a diverse group of students studying abroad. And it's not just, it's racial diversity, it's both men and women, and it's economic diversity. So I think there are a number of initiatives out there which are sending messages that the universities have an obligation to be more active and intentional about recruiting students and encouraging students to study abroad. We have a long way to go, but each of these initiatives, each of these efforts, and every time we have a conversation like this and get more intentionality about it, we are making progress in the right direction.
Great to hear. Christian, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the multilateral exchange programs that you have. Maybe give us an example of one and the degree to which it was successful or you might have had challenges.
Yes, I'd love to. May I, before also answer?
Sure, please.
Provide a quick comment on the question, because I think it was such an important one, and it's especially also in the German context, because got to be honest, also at the Bosch Foundation, very often, our exchange programs are somewhat of an elite exchange. We elite because we we have, with our limited resources, we have to look for future leaders, multipliers, and they tend to be not the disadvantaged ones. And this is, but we're constantly looking for ways how to tackle the issue that you raised. You know, in the German school system, that adds to the complexity. You might be familiar with it, that the school system is still, I mean, we've been restructuring it, but it still has more or less three basic, types of schools, and only one would enable you to get into university later on. So this is not always fair. However, we noticed that, again, it comes back to topics. If you choose the right topic, you can widen the context of the exchange programs and move it a little bit away from the only from the, I'm exaggerating here, for the elites, but I mean the European understanding of elite, which still is a very rather positive one. Vocational training, that is one main topic for us and our exchange programs nowadays. And you know that's one of the very successful German exporting goods, so to speak. Wherever I travel in my portfolio, America and Asia, be it in the US, be it in China, be it in India, our partners approach me saying, well, how could is there a possibility for best practice transfer? We need that system, we need that vocational training system, which seems to be the backbone of the successful German economy, and there is some truth to that. And we started this now also in the transatlantic context. But again, I mean, the numbers you've raised here, you were talking about thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of students. Again, when I talk about the Bosch Foundation programs, we talk about maybe dozens of participants or something like that. Anyways, so we've started, it's just an embryo, so to speak, together with the US Embassy in Berlin. We started a transatlantic exchange program for German, basically for, what's the word, apprentices, German, and on the American side, it's participants who go to community college to learn a trade. And you cannot imagine how many applications we get, what great an interest there is. It is difficult to convince the more conservative members of the board who follow the multiplier leader, future leader narrative, why we should also support such a program. But I think there's two great outcomes. One is that we widen the target group and that we make sure that international exchange is not only for the affluent, privileged ones. And the second one is, again, it's a topic that is of vital importance for the German economy, but also for the American economy. So it's really, it's focused, topic-oriented problem solving, I'd say. Sorry, that was a longer comment than I...
Sure, and some people go into these programs as leaders, but many of them come out of the programs as leaders, right? So you can have an exchange program that actually helps to develop leaders.
Yes, exactly.
Even if it's not obvious going in.
And I would say that in our current political environment, I feel more motivated every day that we need a global perspective throughout our society. I mean, it is not enough to have a leadership class of people who are engaged in the world. We need people throughout our society who are engaged in the world and have a personal understanding of why it matters that we should be engaged in the world. So programs like you're suggesting with vocational education or whatever it is, I think that reinforces for me the notion that we need leaders, not just leaders at the top that we all see on TV every night. We need leaders throughout society in every one of our communities that are more knowledgeable and understanding and open and embracing of our participation in the world.
So we're meeting on Capitol Hill, and part of the discussion today is about public policy as well. Can you all identify public policy, either challenges or opportunities that we ought to be thinking about?
Yes, thank you.
Marlene.
Many of you know that NAFSA, among our priority work is advocacy. We have a full-time staff of 10 that is working on advocacy all of the time, and we work on issues such as the Simon program on international education a few years ago, but more recently our priorities have been comprehensive immigration reform and opening up Cuba, opening up the U.S. to Cuba. And we believe that those two agendas are extremely important for the face that we give to the world. In the case of immigration reform, our immigration laws were written at a time when the world was very different. There are so many detailed aspects of that law that inhibit the exchange of students to the mobility of students to the United States. And most of those problems require congressional action. And while they are a very small part of the immigration law, and many people would say, well, why don't we just go fix our 16 pieces? The political fact is that we can't fix those 16 because every interest group in America has 16 issues that they want. So we all have to get together and say, we're going to have a comprehensive package. We were very close to it during the Bush administration, and unfortunately we didn't make it. And so we're now in a different place, and we have to just tough it out for a while yet. I think the lifting of the embargo is the other.
Before you get to Cuba, let me ask you to just drill down a little bit. For
Okay.
folks in the room who are thinking immigration reform, maybe we've got congressional staff here. That's a broad term.
Well,
Specifically,
the biggest
what pieces?
The biggest issue that affects students is dual intent. So an 18-year-old in Afghanistan who wants to study here applies for a visa, and they have to say, I will not stay in the United States. Well, I don't know about the 18-year-olds in your family, but there are very few 18-year-olds anywhere in the world who can promise anything 4 years from now. I mean, they may or may not know where they're going to be on Friday, but they certainly can't make a commitment to what they're going to be doing in 4 years. It's a totally unrealistic expectation, and it's a hindrance. The other one is now the requirement for a personal interview. And we need, the law needs to be changed to give the embassy or the Secretary of State the option of not requiring a personal interview. Right now, the personal interview is an extreme hardship for many, many, many students, not only in the developing world, but also in Europe. I mean, if you live if you live across the border in Sweden and you live at the south, so you're literally a 12-minute train ride to the embassy in Copenhagen, you can't go there to apply for your visa. You have to go to Stockholm, which is an overnight hotel bill and an appointment and all that. So it's kind of ridiculous. But it's the reality, and there are some countries now that are offering a reciprocal opportunity for American students to study abroad, so they have to go to Chicago to get a visa for Spain and things like that. And personally, I think the reciprocity is a very good thing, because I think Americans need to understand how it is in the world. I don't like it, but I think it's appropriate. So those are two examples which are particular hardships.
Allan, some thoughts, public policy
Thank you
challenges?
for your and NAFSA's advocacy. These issues are very important for public and private people interested
Exactly.
in exchange. I'd make two observations. In the videos from the three congressmen, they all mentioned how important it is to get information out to constituents who are in parts of their districts less well served, parts of their districts where opportunity may be more constrained, where it's not natural to think of an educational exchange opportunity, or vocational education having an international exchange opportunity. What I find here on the Hill is every congressional office is a little different. You have to know the district that they're serving, and how best, as an exchange community, can we not reach everybody, but how can we reach the people that the congresswomen and the congressmen want to reach in their district? So how do we help them better understand the program? I'm also struck that there is broad bipartisan support for exchanges on Capitol Hill, from Fulbright to Gilman to many other things, because congresswomen and congressmen see the benefit that comes back to their home university, the community college, the state university system, the community that they're also serving. And we need to tell that story better. We tend to tell the story about how I got transformed by studying abroad. What we're asking alumni to tell is the story of how, after you came back, how did you transform the community that you came from, especially if you came from a diverse community? Who did you help to get a passport? Who did you help to have a study abroad opportunity now that you have it?
Christian, public policy
Yes.
challenges that
Well,
you all have faced, or?
We're a private foundation, and our biggest and most important asset is our credibility. And so we need to be very careful when it comes to advocacy, at least direct advocacy. We see ourselves not as, we're not a think tank. We don't produce policy recommendations or anything, but we provide platforms for experts on the national and international level to work on public policy issues. And this is my cheap attempt to build the segue to your question before when you asked me about the global governance futures, but maybe it makes sense because there is, the substance, the content of that format is current global public policy issues. I mentioned them before: cybersecurity, for example, global arms control, global pandemics, migration, integration, and so forth. And we believe that time is over, is past us for unilateral or bilateral ways of solving these problems in an ever more connected, globalized world. So we think of providing a platform or a table and strategically invite certain players to the table. Again, traditional partners, friends of Germany, like the US, but we also, in this specific format, there's American participants, German participants, Indians, Japanese, and Chinese. And the biggest challenge there is, again, they all have stakes in the issues involved and different perspectives on these issues, but we think, since it's going to be, we need a new generation of global leaders, so we try to provide a training platform that hopefully future global leaders can try out how it works to come to from our perspective, to a compromise, consensus compromise without being compromised. Because it is a difference when you talk about, for example, cybersecurity. Well, maybe cybersecurity is the most delicate issue these days from the German perspective in the transatlantic relationship. So I'd rather say geoengineering, for example. In geoengineering, the German-American perspective might be a little more similar, closer than, for example, again, the Chinese one. So, of course, the question then is, what's the impact of a format like this when we invite a handful of Americans, a handful of Chinese, and other participants to a program like that? Well, the impact, and maybe there we can make a little contribution regarding debate of public policy issues, and that's that we have a strong network of partners. I said before, we're not a think tank, so in each of these countries we partner with one think tank and one university. So there's the academic substance and the think tank outreach and stage, so to speak. In the US, it's the Brookings Institution and Princeton University. And in the other countries, other think tanks and universities. And then, of course, it all depends on selecting the right participants. Another big challenge, maybe we tackle that later in this discussion. How can we evaluate the impact of what we're doing with our exchange programs?
How do you do that?
Well, I was afraid you'd ask that question. And I don't have the answer in my notes here. As I said before, Bosch wanted us to foster international understanding. How do you measure that? Well, it's, I think a very tangible, very good approach is to look at the participants and where they go as alumni, what they do or not do, and whether or not this is related to their participation in the program. For example, and I cannot leave this unmentioned here, we have a Bosch alum in the White House. Dennis McDonough is a Bosch 16 with Rob Fenstermacher. He said it was the best year, Bosch 16. Adam Hunter, who's Bosch 20, might think differently. There we have it's a leader in the White House who's a Bosch alum. Yeah, but we might want to ask Dennis McDonough the question: did you become that White House Chief of Staff because of or in spite of participation in the Bosch program, right? I mean, there must not be, or I don't know whether there's a direct connection anyway. So you have to follow the alumni and see where they're going, whether the program had any impact on their further career choices, career paths. That's one approach to measuring the impact, the success. Another one, of course, is this leads back to partners. We believe that the more partners you find for an idea, the better the idea is potentially. So, for example, this network of partners in the global governance futures gives us the impression that that what we're doing there goes beyond our Bosch Foundation world, and the other partners will also disseminate results in the US context, in the Chinese context, in the Japanese context, and so forth. And this hopefully, at least quantitatively, creates some impact. But Ilir, you're right. If you follow up with, well, this is not specific enough. I mean, this is the biggest challenge we face every day at the foundation.
And it's critical. It goes back to what Allan was saying before, right? Which is that the exchange community has to constantly tell the story about exchanges. And it's, yes, it is compelling to talk about how it's changed you as a participant, but then what happened after. And following that can be hard. And some of it is anecdotal.
I mean, I think it's really important that we don't let measurement become the enemy, because not everything important can be measured. At the same time, when we talk about Dennis McDonough in the White House having a Bosch fellowship, I believe that Dennis is a really model example of a person whose international experience has guided many, many aspects of the work he's doing today and has for the last 8 years. 7 years, almost 8 years, 7 years ago soon, when at NAFSA's annual conference, we did as part of our advocacy initiative, we invited all the presidential candidates to send somebody to a session very much like this to talk about how their candidate would approach international education and these issues. And Dennis was the person who represented the Obama campaign. And he was by far the most articulate person on that panel. And I believe it was because he was the person who had the most personal experience in what these kinds of programs meant, and that he was able to integrate those experiences into how he talked about it. And it is not by accident that the National Security Council is doing some of the most creative work on exchanges right now in the country. I believe Dennis McDonough is one of the influential individuals on that, on 100,000 Strong in China, in Latin America, and a number of other things that have been going on as it relates to international education in the administration. So I would say you done good.
And of course, we do have.
May I quote you in our next board meeting? I'd like to.
Yes, you may.
And we do have
if you excuse my language.
Some numbers around impact, right? I mean, $27 billion, if I'm not mistaken, would it be international students contribute to the U.S. economy. $1.6 million hours of community service. We know that from the surveys that folks who run these programs, the people who go through exchange programs, come to the United States, leave with a much more favorable impression. We know that to be true of Muslim students and others. And so those numbers are out there, and we need to quote them. I think part of what we're hearing is that we need to drill down even more specifically around specific programs to be able to tell those stories like the story you told. Why don't we open it up to questions from the audience? We had lots of participation earlier. Here's a question right here. And then we'll go, I think I saw a hand over there after. So here and then someone over here. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Really appreciate it. My name is Jennifer Huffman, and I am an alumna of the Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange Program for Young Professionals. I had a couple of comments, and then I wanted to round that up with a question. A couple of overall points. When I saw the title of this discussion, I saw private sector perspectives, the word non-government exchange, and public diplomacy. Those are kind of the keywords that stood out to me. And I was somewhat surprised not to see a private sector as defined as a business joining the panel today to provide a direct perspective on some of this. But then I also thought private sector could mean funding, non-government exchanges could mean funding, so Bosch, for example, or it could mean experience, where your exchange experience revolves around a private sector experience. And then I thought about public diplomacy. I thought from the State Department perspective, the government perspective, and then I thought of government affairs and external affairs in a business that has a lot of overlapping issues. To bring this to me for a second, CBYX is a publicly funded program, and I interned in the German Bundestag, which is a public entity. While doing graduate school, I got a internship with BMW, which was a privately funded experience at a private company. So I've really been fortunate to have these great experiences encompass a lot of different points of what you're talking about. But to bring it all together, my question basically is, where's the business world, the traditional large cap, medium cap businesses on exchanges today? What is that tone in the partnerships that you have and in the conversations you have? But down to a more local level, what do we say to businesses when one of our exchange students goes to a business, knocks on their door and says, "Hi, I'm from Germany. I would love to work for your business." What's the company's incentive when you hear, they probably get an earful of take my American student, take my son, my daughter, whomever in that area. So I'd be curious as to what message you would formulate to these businesses to encourage them to take these students. I'm biased and I have my own opinions, but I would be really interested in hearing that because I think that's part of our message that we don't always effectively communicate. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Jennifer. Reactions, thoughts?
Well, I can say a couple of things. First, on what private sector is and the level of private sector involvement in supporting exchange right now through the two programs, 100,000 strong in China and 100,000 strong in Latin America. Both of those programs have been exclusively funded. Well, I should say not quite, but just about 95% funded by private sector companies, from Coca-Cola to Banco Santander to Shell to many different companies. And that is the model of those programs. So that is how they are continuing to be funded. I just lost your other question.
The question, yeah.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, one of the basic problems in U.S. companies hiring international candidates, i.e. international graduates of our school, is the cap on H1B. And that's one of the other points in our advocacy agenda is to either increase or eliminate the cap on H1Bs. It's a terrible impediment right now, and so I encourage you to join our advocacy efforts. You go to www.connectingourworld.org and sign up so that you can help us advocate with your members of Congress. These are really important issues, and unless there's a groundswell of support for them, they're not going to change.
Christian?
Well, 2 points. First is we strongly believe in public-private partnerships. Some of the programs I mentioned before, we run together with companies, not only with company-related foundations, but with companies like BMW, Siemens, Deutsche Bank, and so forth. I mean, we are a private foundation. We have to be a little on the lookout here and there because, again, we're not the CSR branch of the company. We're the independent organization. But for us, it's not as difficult as for other foundations because the nature of the product of the Bosch company is kind of remote from our activities. It's different with other companies and their foundations. Well, second point is companies are also our key partners on the ground in our exchange programs because we, again, as I said before, we don't give scholarships for students to go to universities, but we invite, for example, again, in this aforementioned Bosch Fellowship Program, young American professionals to come to Germany and not go to a school, university, whatever, but to work in the public and in the private sector to get a better understanding of how Germany works. And we call these, well, they're not internships, and we're still, after 32 years, we still haven't found a better word for it than the French stage. Because we want to say, and this is true, I mean, the young American professionals, there are no interns, but they have professional work, they have a university degree, professional work experience, and so forth, so they bring something to the table. And we have well, sometimes here and there, but usually we don't have any problems at all finding placements for our fellows, for big companies, small companies, because they, of course, they love the idea of getting a great American young professional more or less on the payroll of the Bosch Foundation with a stipend that we pay. And they really, as I said, it's much more than an internship. They become temporary junior, sometimes senior staff in these, or employees in these companies. So public-private partnerships for us, again, is the best thing. Also shows the quality of an idea, we think, if you achieve finding this diverse network of partners. And the second thing is companies, businesses on the ground are for us the most important targets, so to speak. Well, we send, not target, we had the military panel before, I don't mean in a military way, target institutions for our fellows to be sent to.
I think for me, you've got to, Jennifer, watch this space. In the 20th century, you had the Rhodes Scholarships, which did so much and now are expanding all over the world. In the 21st century, businesses stepped up again with the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University in China. That is going to be something that the business community, the entrepreneur community, the hedge fund community is going to realize is going to shape countries, entire regions, and the next generation of leaders. So business is beginning to step up in a big way, but like Cecil Rhodes, it's individual by individual. And I think you've got a great resume already, and your opening is when you get the chance to explain to an employer what is the Congressional Bundestag Exchange Program and what did you do. And that's what I think exchange students have over many that don't have the experience. The moment you can say, I have gone to an interesting place, I've worked in another parliament, I've been there at an interesting time, you can carry an interview for a job. People want to know about you, but they also know you have the flexibility, the respect, the tolerance that comes with fending for yourself in an area, culture, an environment outside the one you're familiar with and comfortable with.
Yeah, just a quick anecdote about that. My wife and I were in Albania 30 years ago, and over the course of, so I get questions about Albania and being Albanian, right, because my name and my heritage, but on her resume, at the very bottom is this, brief stint we had in Albania, and that's one of the questions she gets repeatedly over the last 30 years if she's ever interviewing for something is, oh, tell me about that. So, Allan, you're absolutely right. There was a question over here. Okay.
Hi, my name is
We'll get you
Chris
next.
Kirkham. I'm here as an intern with the World Affairs Council of Seattle. And I noticed that today we were discussing a lot about university and professional exchanges. And I was wondering about younger students, such as high school or middle school students. And so my question is, do you see a need to include these students to international exchange opportunities, as well as how non-governmental exchanges can kind of play a role in increasing the participation of younger students in these opportunities? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thoughts, response? Yeah.
I think we're cooked if we don't reach the widest possible groups of students in education from high school through college through graduate school because it's too late to say, well, let's all plan on a junior year abroad. Nobody practically does a junior year abroad anymore. So I think we need to plant the seeds early. We have 1,000 teachers now in Generation Study Abroad who've committed to, in their high schools, making it possible for students to study abroad. And 10 years ago, I think maybe none of us would have said you've got to start much earlier than we traditionally did, but now we do.
Well, and I think that programs like the Mandarin Language Initiative that is that the 100,000 Strong in China has morphed to, teaching more Mandarin in high schools, K-12 high schools. That is an example of a really important direction because those children will want to study in China. You don't study a language for 5 or 6 years and not want to go to China. And in fact, most of the existing Chinese language programs in the country, of which there are many, and they're mostly in public schools, or some in private schools too, but most of the Mandarin in high schools or in this country are taught in public schools. Most of those programs take the students to Taiwan or mainland China at least once, and many of them are going twice. They're going to Taiwan in 1 year, and the second year they're going to mainland or vice versa. So, I mean, and that's been going on for 25 years already in this country. So I think there is an interest, a growing interest on the part of high school students. What there is, one of the issues that is a reality is that an increased number of middle-class families in this country take a trip abroad with their kids when they're 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. And so studying abroad on AFS or some of the other programs that were such important programs, my generation, one of the challenges that we have in those programs now is that students have already been abroad once or twice, the kids who were typically AFS students. And the other aspect, of course, is that for programs like AFS, I've been on the board of AFS and I've been a host sister, so I know AFS pretty well. We have a much harder time recruiting American students to study abroad than we do recruiting host families.
Mm-hmm.
Another question on this side of the room, and then I'll come over here, blue shirt. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Christy Hunter with Global Leadership Excellence, and our organization has been providing metrics for some of these soft skills for exchange and study abroad. Since 2009, it kind of traverses the continuum of high school to university to private sector. But for us, the challenge is that we're giving that to the individual or to the organization directly. But if somebody wants more direct information that can help provide more messaging to the government, to the State Department, is that something that is helpful to you to recruit more people? We're very happy to help with you because there are other organizations like ours who do that. But it is challenging in many cases to build the case and demonstrate the need, the value that is gained from such exchanges and programming. But it can be done. Mm-hmm. We do that all the time and then align it with the demographics of the person, including that working professional who had exchanges and study abroad and has done a lot of travel. So those kinds of things are available, but if you want, more alignment can be
Give me your card afterwards.
I'd be happy to.
Thank you so much. Questions over here? Over here.
Hello, my name is Pamela Ruiz. I'm with the Federation EIL, and my question really sort of builds on some of the other really good questions that have already been asked. I think that everyone in the room knows the importance of international education no matter what field somebody goes into. We know it's important, especially for our field, but also for, I believe, economics, whether it's Department of Defense, whatever it is. How do we work with private industry? How do we advocate to private industry and those hiring to encourage them to see the value that we see in global skills? So if you have a hiring manager, not just at multinational companies, but also just at a national company, that hiring manager, in my experience, does not necessarily see the value in global experience. So how do we advocate? I think of NAFSA particularly does obviously a great job at advocating to our government and to our public officials. How do we advocate to the private industry? How do we partner with them so that they see the value, so that therefore those that are studying and teaching at the university level will also see the value in having that type of international education and aspire to do that? How can we partner more with the private industry?
Thoughts?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. That's one of the very active pieces of the Education Abroad group in NAFSA is to work with students to help them articulate the value of their education abroad experience. I think it's not adequate to put on your resume that I studied abroad in Spain and expect anybody to see that as necessarily an asset. We have to help the students reflect on what the experience they had contributed to their capacity as a potential employee. And so one part of it is the responsibility of students and potential employees to be able to do a better job of explaining to an employer why that matters on their resume, what it did for them. I do know that there is very often a disconnect between what CEOs articulate they want in employees and what their hiring managers are doing. We've seen it many times. And that's not an easy one to fix. It helps that we understand it, that we know that it exists, but it's not enough. And I've had conversations with CEOs in which they tell me that the successor to themselves at the company is going to be an international person, not going to be an American-born person. And I say to them, well, have you done some work to deliver that message down to the human resource department in your organization? Because that is where you're going to find employees if they understand what your commitments are. So I think we have to work on that a little bit more. And I don't have an answer for you, but I know it's a problem.
Christian?
It's a fascinating question. For me as a German, we don't have that problem. I mean, in Germany, you would not get a good job without any international experience.
Exactly.
I mean, of course, I like to say that we kind of have a competitive advantage due to being surrounded by international neighbors. So international exchange is kind of not in our genes, but in our DNA, but as a young kid in high school, every high school student at some point goes to France or England or the more from the more affluent families to the U.S. for a high school year or so when they don't get a scholarship and have to pay for themselves. Anyway, so international experience is a given. I mean, it's a necessity. I mean, for getting a good job. I was wondering whether there's anything that we do right that we could export to the U.S., but I think it's just due to, again, geography. However, I think, and this made me think of another, coming back to the impact question when we're talking about alumni and alumni networks, I always feel that there is, at least for us at the foundation, so much more potential to make better use of our alumni. There are so many, and all the organizations that are represented here, all your alumni, I mean, if we just pooled resources in some in some good way to, I mean, we have the agents for for international exchange all over the US with mostly great experience having been on our program. So, and they're working in companies, in the public, in the private sector. I don't know how we can achieve that, but we should use that network better in order to convince in this case, in the companies of the value of international exchange, and not by word, but by, I mean, somebody who's a mentor, who's been there, done that, like another Bosch alumna, Sandra Peterson, who now is chairwoman worldwide of Johnson & Johnson, totally private sector leader, and the Sandra Petersons and other alumni, they need to spread the word. They need to convince their colleagues or bosses or whatever of the value of exchange.
Let me get in one last question. A woman in the back has been waiting to ask a question.
Good afternoon. My name is Suhaila Aman, and I'm the International Admissions Coordinator for the University of Michigan in Dearborn, as well as a speaker at the conference this week. I'm learning a great deal from each of you, and I wanted to ask, taking this back to how do we create more diversity among the students in the United States that are going to study abroad, how have your organizations helped to educate minority and ethnic communities on the importance and the impact of study abroad programs? As someone who's a community leader in the Muslim and Arab American community in metropolitan Detroit, I'm probably the most vocal advocate for study abroad and to even encourage parents to send their children away and have them study outside of the community, even though I work within the community. I think it would be important for each of your organizations or for you to, at national conferences or regional conferences, to be able to educate other leaders within the different universities on how to connect with community leaders in these ethnic and minority communities, because ultimately at the end of the day, and those who work in international education see as we're traveling abroad, how important it is to establish that level of trust with parents. And it still works in these American communities within the United States. So if you're able to connect with them, with leadership who are then able to have conversations with the community members or having some type of meeting, I think that would be of great benefit to expanding the opportunities for American students of ethnic and minority backgrounds to study abroad. But I'd also like to know if anybody is doing anything or if there is something that you're aware of, so those of us who want to encourage study abroad programs are able to tap into those resources for further education.
I've heard of your work, and I think it's very much appreciated in the Dearborn community and the Michigan system. Our best-selling book, it's $1 a copy, is A Parent's Guide to Study Abroad, the Spanish edition. We published study abroad guides for 100 years. Never wrote a book for parents, and sold out of the first edition a few years ago. And someone said, really help if you could write an edition in Spanish, because so many of our students are first generation in this minority serving institution, and their parents speak Spanish. So I think that's one concrete thing, and I bet you there are 10 other things we're going to learn from that we ought to do, because the community we have to reach is the parents.
Can you all join me in thanking our panelists today?
Thank you.
Thank you.